Hey guys, welcome back. If you're new here, hi, my name is Jessica and welcome to my channel where I explore new true crime cases each week. Last week we talked about Leonarda Cinciulli and how you don't want to buy anything she's selling. If you want to know why, I'll make sure to have that video linked up here in the card for you. And if you just have an interest in true crime in general like me and you'd like to join me back here each week, go ahead and subscribe to my channel down below. And with all that being said, let's go ahead and get into today's case. John George Haigh was born on July 24th, 1909 in the UK in Stamford, Lincolnshire. He was the only child born to his parents Emily Hudson and John Robert Haigh. Since our central figure and his father both inconsiderately have the same name, I'll be referring to our main John as John, and I'll be referring to his father as John Robert. Cool? Now, John had a very different childhood, and when I say different, I don't mean good. The Haighs were extremely religious, belonging to an evangelical Protestant sect known as the Plymouth Brethren. This translated into John's home environment by way of kind of ridiculous and over-the-top rules. The only thing he was ever allowed to do for fun was study the Bible. Anything else was strictly forbidden because his father believed that it was a sin to be happy. Sounds like a rip-roaring good time, am I right? Now, I'm certainly not knocking religion, not in the slightest. I think it's incredible that some people find comfort in their faith, but a sin to just be happy? Yikes. John's childhood was, in his own words, bleak and lonely. He was an only child and he had no friends other than a couple of pets. His family was also literally isolated from the outside world by a large privacy fence his father had built around their home because he believed that the world was evil. Throughout his upbringing, John was constantly reminded by his father that the Lord was watching. John Robert went as far as to tell John that a bluish scar on his own head was a mark of the devil that he'd received from sins he'd committed as a child. John was definitely made to fear his religion more so than he was to embrace it. He obsessed over the idea that any minor slip-up could leave him branded for life. His father obviously went to really extreme lengths to instill this faith in his son, but John claimed to have actually been severely negatively affected mentally by his religion. He claimed that as a child he was haunted by nightmares of forests of bleeding crosses and strangers forcing him to drink blood. And mind you, this started young, so that's pretty heavy stuff for like a preschooler. When John was 7, he was enrolled in a private elementary school, which then led him to a very prestigious private middle school. His parents always maintained outrageously high expectations of him, and to ensure that he lived up to his potential, they were incredibly overbearing. But, like most overly sheltered kids do, John eventually began to rebel. He started off carefully with little white lies and innocent fibs, but as he continued to see no repercussions, he started to believe that he was invincible, and as long as he looked and acted the way his parents wanted, that he could get away with anything. This realization eventually led him to stop believing in his family's faith altogether, but he did continue to attend church services with them to keep up appearances. After high school, John took a job working in insurance sales, which actually suited him quite well. He worked his way up through the company pretty quickly and was able to use this experience to land a job as a broker for an even larger company. But despite the fact that he was making a decent and honest salary, John decided that he much preferred the idea of making fast money with minimal effort. So he started stealing money from the company. At first, no one noticed, so with confidence, John started taking more and more money each time until finally somebody did notice. He was never caught, with his hand in the register, so to speak, but they still fired his ass. And he was pissed until he realized that maybe this was a blessing in disguise. Maybe he should be his own boss. So he tried to start a few businesses, but they all flopped. Business savvy was not something he seemed to have going for him. Luckily, what he lacked in business insight, he made up for in charisma. John was a well-dressed, charming guy with piercing blue eyes. He had his pick of the ladies, ultimately setting his eyes on one young woman in particular, a woman named Beatrice or Betty Hammer. John and Betty dated for a few months before they were married in 1934. That same year, John finally stopped attending church with his parents, which did not go over well. They took this to mean that John had chosen Satan's path. Little did they know just how far their son would fall. With a wife to support, John was more desperate for money now than ever before. But he still didn't want to work for that money. Instead, he began financing vehicles under fake names that he would then turn around and resell for a huge profit. And he made a ton of money with this scam over the course of just a few months. But eventually, his little hustle was discovered and he was arrested for fraud in November of 1934. At the time of his arrest, Betty was pregnant with their daughter, but given the circumstances, she wasn't pumped about it. She put their daughter up for adoption and decided from that point that their marriage was over. She gave that man 0 second chances. When John was released from prison, he returned home to his parents since, he didn't have a wife to go home to. They were hesitant at first to let him back, but he promised them that he'd changed and that he was going to be living his life on the right side of the law from now on. He even briefly started attending church with them again to convince them that he really had seen the light. And they were so happy that he seemed to be turning his life around that they actually loaned him a decent chunk of money to help get him back on his feet. He took this money and used it to open up a dry cleaning business, which actually started off pretty promisingly, but over time his profits tapered off and the business went under, which John took really hard. He was convinced that no matter how hard he worked to make an honest living, it was never going to be as lucrative as scamming people had proved to be. So he moved out of his parents' place to his own place in London to pursue his next ruse. Only problem was, he hadn't thought of what that might be yet. So to hold him over financially, he began working as a chauffeur for the McSwan family. The McSwans were a wealthy and prominent family in London with whom John really hit it off with. Their son William was around John's age, and those two actually ended up becoming really close friends as well. John kept in touch with the whole family, even after his employment with them had come to an end. But he did quit his job with them as soon as he'd finalized his newest business venture. This time, John rented out an office space and posed as an affiliate for a well-respected law firm. He then fabricated paperwork and faked the sale of stock shares to investors who were looking to put money into local businesses. He sold these fake shares, collected money from multiple investors, and then vacated the office space before the ink on their paperwork even dried. The scam was so successful that John ran it again and again and again, until finally in 1937 he was arrested and sentenced to 4 years in prison. And he was pissed. He had always been so sure that he could talk his way out of anything, but this time it hadn't worked. So at the very least, John was determined to cut his sentence short. He assumed the role of model inmate, and in 1940, due to good behavior, John was released after only serving 3 of his 4 years. After his release, John got a job as a firefighter in hopes of not only gaining trust and respect within the community, but also to support himself while he hatched a new plan. Because this man would just not fucking learn. And a few months later, he landed his ass right back in prison for theft. But this prison stay was different. It was during this prison stay that John had an epiphany. You see, the reason that all of his operations had failed up to this point was the fact that there was always someone left scorn to point the finger at him. He wasn't the problem. Everybody else was. Obviously, this meant that if there was no one left to blow the whistle on his next plan, whatever that may be, he could 100%, without a doubt, get away with it. So it was settled. His next scheme had to end with murder. But just, oh, I'm gonna kill the next guy, that wasn't enough. He knew he had to do so without leaving behind a body or any evidence. For months, he obsessed over how he could permanently dispose of someone's body because, in his mind, no body, no crime, right? And then John remembered reading about a man named Georges Alexandre Serret. Serret was a French murderer notorious for dissolving the bodies of his victims in sulfuric acid. John decided he could easily use this exact method to dispose of his victims' bodies. To test this theory, he gathered field mice from around the prison grounds and submerged them in acid to learn exactly how it would react with flesh. I don't know how the hell he was able to pull off these experiments while in prison, but he did, and he was pleasantly surprised to learn that within 30 minutes, the acid had completely liquefied the mice. It was perfect. As soon as he was released from prison, he would claim his first victim. John was released from prison in 1943, which was about 2 years after he'd formulated what, in his sick, twisted little mind, was the perfect plan. He was confident that his prison days were behind him and that he was about to be very rich. But first, damage control. He reached out to his parents, yet again begging for their forgiveness. He promised them that this time he really was a changed man. Because, all the other this times before, yeah, he actually wasn't then. But this time, he really was, for sure, definitely, totally a changed man. Now, what we know to be obvious bullshit, his parents couldn't seem to clock. That, or they just refused to believe what a shady lowlife their son had become. Either way, they forgave him and allowed him to move back home with them, but the arrangement was extremely temporary. He stayed with them just until he'd built up enough money to move back to London. Once he was back in the city, he got an apartment, and here's the kicker, he got a job as a salesman. Dude, you're doing it right. Just keep doing that. Why start killing people? He was a really good salesman. He was making decent money. Why not just see that through? Dumbass. John used the money from his day job to rent out a basement room across town from his apartment. He took some time to renovate the space into his perfect little workshop. And then he spent the next whole ass year accumulating small amounts of sulfuric acid until he had enough to dissolve a human body. If nothing else, I guess I've got to give it to him that he has some serious patience and determination. If only he could have channeled that into being fucking normal, but no. In August of 1944, with everything perfectly in place, John set out for his first victim. Someone he knew quite well and that he'd actually already established trust with, William McSwan. It had been years since John had seen his good friend William, but he still managed to track him down fairly easily. He found him sitting in a bar that they had frequented together back when John worked for the family. He approached his old friend and acted just shocked to be running into him, as if he hadn't been planning this shit for the last 3 years. He sat down with him, and they started talking and drinking, and it was like they never missed a beat. John fed William a bunch of BS about what was going on in his life, and William confided in John that he really wasn't doing well. He was terrified about potentially getting drafted into World War II. Little did William know, John was there to save the day. Upon hearing this, John's like, "Don't worry, bro, I know a guy." He told William that he had connections, and that these connections could easily help him hide out and escape the draft. That he himself would be more than willing to take care of William's personal and financial affairs while he was gone. And poor, desperate, naive little William, he was thrilled. He took a few weeks, and as fast as he possibly could, he got everything ready to hand over to John. He even spoke to his parents before he left to let them know that he was going into hiding and that it would likely be quite some time before they got to speak again. But not to worry, because their old trusted employee and friend, John George Haigh, was at the reins, so everything would be fine. But on September 9th, 1944, instead of shipping him off to safety, John bludgeoned him over the head. He felt no remorse looking at his friend's body. Instead, he felt powerful. He placed William's body into a large metal drum and covered it with sulfuric acid. He then waited anxiously for the acid to dissolve his friend's body so he could more easily dispose of it. When he opened the barrel, he was thrilled to discover that it was now only filled with like a putrid sludge. Just as he'd hoped and expected, the acid had completely liquefied any trace of his friend. He then proudly poured the contents of the barrel down the floor drain in the middle of his workshop. He was so excited. He just pulled off what he believed to be the perfect crime, and as a result, he was about to be very rich. From there, he began corresponding with and even visiting William's parents to keep up this act that William was safe and in hiding. Not only did the McSwans believe John, but they thanked him profusely for everything they thought he was doing to protect their son. John's specialty really was looking and acting like a genuine, trustworthy man, and because of this, the McSwans were none the wiser. They gave him money to go towards William's expenses and also allowed John to collect money from William's personal businesses. This all ended up being surprisingly easy for John to keep up. The McSwans seemed to go along with whatever he said, no questions asked. But William's parents weren't the only people that he needed to keep up appearances with. John also spent hours and hours writing letters and cards to William's closest friends. And because John had meticulously perfected William's handwriting, at no point did anyone ever question the validity of these letters. I'm sorry. You cannot sit here and honestly tell me that any of this sounds easier or less stressful than just a regular-ass job. He spent more time trying to keep his story straight and William's affairs in order than he ever would have to just clock in and out somewhere every day. I guess at this point it had really become less about the money and more about the power and manipulation aspect. I don't know any real jobs that offer that in their description, so... Now, you're probably thinking, well, surely he can't keep this up forever. And you're right, and John knew that too. He knew that sooner or later, people were going to start asking more questions. So, just like that, it was time to carry out his next murders. Those of William's parents, Donald and Amy McSwan. On July 2nd, 1945, John lured Mr. and Mrs. McSwan back to his workshop by telling them that William was back for a surprise visit. When they arrived, John took them into the workshop one at a time, starting with Mr. McSwan, and before Donald could even look around the room for his son, John bludgeoned him over the head until he crumbled to the ground. He then immediately went back outside and retrieved Mrs. McSwan, who sadly met the same fate as her husband and son before her. Once he'd secured their valuables, John then began dismembering their bodies in order to fit them into the bathtub he intended to dissolve them in. It took hours, but he didn't care. With the McSwans dead and gone, he knew the money he was working towards was more than worth it. So while his bathtub body soup did its thing, John cleaned up the rest of the workshop before tipping the bathtub on its side and letting the sludge of the McSwans trickle down the floor drain. And now it was time to get his hands on as much of their money as he possibly could. His plan was to convince those closest to the McSwans that they were on a trip to America for an indefinite amount of time. He then posed as William McSwan and visited a law office where he signed over power of attorney to all of William's assets to himself. This gave John legal access to everything William owned. And over time, he used his William McSwan Act to procure and sell properties that had belonged to William's parents as well. He also raided their homes and collected anything of value he could make off with. Overall, he banked about $300,000 in today's money from the McSwans' deaths. But even sitting pretty with more money than he needed to live comfortably for years to come, he still wanted more. And frankly, due to his new gambling addiction, he needed more. So in 1947, while living at the prestigious Onslow Court Hotel in London, John befriended a couple named Rosalie and Archibald Henderson, who sadly and unbeknownst to them, were John's next targets. The trio enjoyed gambling, drinking, and spending copious amounts of money together. John made a very intentional effort to be present in Rosalie and Archibald's lives as much as possible, and it was easy. He was friendly and confident, and people naturally seemed to gravitate towards him. He managed to successfully build up a really close friendship with the Hendersons, all while secretly planning their murder. Knowing that their days were numbered, John got busy creating a new workshop in a rundown old building just outside of town. The building was literally falling apart, but John didn't care. It was exactly what he needed. He stocked the secluded building exactly as he had his old basement workshop. Steel drums, a stockpile of acid, and all of the protective equipment he could possibly need. And when his new workshop was prepped and ready, it was go time. In February 1948, John invited the Hendersons to join him on a trip to Brighton, which is just shy of 2 hours outside of London. They accepted, and at first they all genuinely had a really good time together. But a few days into the trip, John invited Archibald to come and check out his workshop. It wasn't too far from where they were staying, and John had a really exciting investment opportunity he wanted to run by him. Archibald was intrigued, so the men talked business for the entire duration of the 20-mile drive to John's gross little rundown workshop. They walked in together, and as soon as the door closed behind them, John pulled out a revolver and shot Archibald Henderson in the back of the head, execution style. He then secured his valuables and hoisted him into one of the steel drums before filling it with acid. He closed the lid and then changed his clothes to head back to Brighton to deal with Rosalie. When he got back to the hotel, he told her that Archibald had gotten sick while they were at the workshop and that she needed to accompany him back there right away. She obviously went with him, no questions asked, and once they made it to the workshop, he led her inside where, just as he had to her husband hours before, John shot her dead. He then placed her body into the drum next to the one containing what was left of Archibald and pumped it full of acid. When their bodies were no more, John took the barrels outside and poured the sludge they now contained on the ground behind the workshop. Then, over the next few months, John forged documents granting himself power of attorney over everything the Hendersons owned. He sold off their properties and faked correspondence with their friends and family, just as he had with the McSwans. He managed to come away from this murder with what would be about $500,000 in today's money, which ended up being enough to fund his gambling addiction for 1 year. Yeah, by late 1948, he had blown through almost all of the Hendersons' money and was starting to fall behind on his finances. He knew in order to maintain the lifestyle he'd grown so accustomed to, he'd have to set his sights on a new victim, and fast. Olive Durand Deacon was a wealthy widow in her late 60s whom John had also met through his residency at the Onslow Court Hotel. She, like so many others before her, was drawn to John's charisma. He was pretty desperate for money at this point, but he knew he had to be patient and play it cool. He nurtured their friendship and painstakingly earned Olive's trust until he finally got the opportunity he'd been waiting for. In February 1949, Olive invited John to look at these, prototype fake fingernail things she'd made. She wanted this to be their new joint business venture. She was hoping that she could be the creative one and that John would figure out the logistics of the mass production aspect. Hearing this idea, John also saw dollar signs, but for a very different reason. About a week later, John called Olive to his workshop to show her the plans and progress he'd made on production of these fingernails, and she was pumped. This was her passion project, and here she thought it was coming to life right before her eyes. But in actuality, as soon as she arrived at the workshop, John shot Olive in the back of the head, execution style. He then submerged her body in a drum of acid, just as he had his previous 5 victims. What John hadn't anticipated, though, was the fact that Olive had been so excited about their new business that she had told some of the other residents of the hotel where she was headed that day. He tried to get ahead of this hiccup by claiming that, yes, they'd had plans to meet up, but Olive had never showed. He even went as far as joining one of Olive's friends at the police station to file the missing persons report for her. He truly believed that he was the smartest person in the room, and that no matter what the situation was, he had the upper hand. Too bad he didn't. Police suspicion towards John was almost immediate. They knew he had a criminal past, and it didn't take them long to discover that he'd been struggling financially prior to Olive's disappearance. He knew he needed to act fast, and even though Olive's body had not finished dissolving yet, John knew it was now or never. He returned to his workshop, hauled the barrel containing Olive's remains behind the building, and poured the contents into the grass. He hid the belongings he'd stolen from her and then tried desperately to carry on as if he didn't have human soup sitting in his backyard. He was chillin'. He was sure that without a body, no murder could be connected to him. No matter how suspicious the police were, they could not arrest him without proof. Thankfully, a body wasn't the only proof police needed to make an arrest. After searching his workshop and discovering the steel drums, the protective equipment, his gun, and most damning, a portion of what were later confirmed to be Olive's dentures, police arrested John George Haigh on February 28, 1949 for the suspected murder of Olive Durand Deacon. Once in custody, he confessed not only to Olive's murder, but also to the murders of the McSwans, the Hendersons, and 3 other murders which have never been confirmed, hence why I didn't detail them here today. And during this confession, John actually had the balls to ask Detective Albert Webb, quote, "Tell me frankly, what are the chances of anybody being released from Broadmoor?" Broadmoor was a high-security psychiatric hospital that I assume John was hoping to end up at. But a total of 9 psychiatrists evaluated John George Haigh, with only one of them believing that there could possibly be a disorder to blame for his actions. In July 1949, at just 40 years old, John was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death by hanging. His execution took place on August 10th, 1949, and he really didn't even seem to care as the noose was fixed around his neck. Before his death, John wrote to his parents that he was proud of how much attention he'd managed to gain from what he'd done. And he wasn't wrong. The media had a field day with his case, plastering his picture anywhere they could. Even in the decades following his crimes, many TV shows, radio shows, and songs have paid homage to John by dramatizing the practice of dissolving a body in acid. I know off the top of my head that both Criminal Minds and Blacklist both had episodes with acid murderers, so clearly it's still a pretty shocking and captivating concept. Way to trailblaze, Mr. Haigh. What a terrible person. Anyways, that's all I have for you guys today. Hope you enjoyed it. Actually, I don't really know what it would say about you if you did, like, enjoy it. So I guess I more hope you found it interesting. I don't know. Let me know in the comments down below. As always, I thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video and to listen to this story. If you haven't already and you'd like to, go ahead and subscribe to my channel down below. I see you, by the way. I see that like 67% of you aren't subscribed. I don't know why you're choosing to watch from outside of the party when you could so easily come in and mingle. Don't be scared. It's fun in here. I put out new true crime content each week, and I would love to see you back here in my next video. Until then, stay safe and have a good week. Bye, guys.